want to welcome everyone here. We are going to be talking with some amazing people who will be presenting and sharing the results, their experiences, and some exciting innovations in education. My name is Marcia Davidson, and I'm going to be moderating this panel and providing some of the questions just to get the discussion started. And this is a panel on scaling evidence-based innovations in education with government partners. Okay, so let me introduce our panelists today. We'll start, the first person is Chris Nielsen, who's an assistant professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton. And he's going to talk to us about a project that he's been working on called Learning the Value of Education, AVE Tree Ed. And our second presenter is Laura Poswell, who is the executive director of JPAL Africa. And she's going to talk to us about her partnership in the research on teaching at the right level, which is a Pratham program. And we have Susanna Hares, who is the international director of ARC and the lead coordinator of Liberia's Liberia's Partnership Schools Program, the PSL for Liberia. And we have Sridhar Rajagopalan, who's from MindSpark. He is the co-founder of educational initiatives that developed MindSpark. So I'm really excited that they're here to talk with us. And I'm going to start the questioning with a question for both Sridhar and Chris. For years, the education sector is focused on how to get more kids in school. And as we know, the question is no longer about access. It's really about learning. So one of the first questions I want to ask is for both of you, how's adaptive learning or nudge-based learning a departure from a more traditional approach to educational policy and programming that might help feed into this new focus on quality education? So let's start with Sridhar.
Thanks, Marcia. So I think that's a great question, and it's something that's really relevant for policymakers, because the usual approach is to say that, I need to have the school there, I need to have the teacher there, I need to have the children coming to the school. And countries have tried this for years. So you've done all those things, and then you found that that has not led to the kind of results that you wanted. So it turns out that this problem of getting children to learn effectively, as it's not news to us, but has been like much more difficult than we would have thought. You thought of it as an administrative problem, saying if I do these things right, it's going to happen, but it's not. And it turns out to be what we call a technical problem, but technical not in the technology sense, but in the sense of education, kind of mastering some of those pieces. Now, one of the technologies that we find seems to work effectively is when you recognize the fact that the students whom you're trying to address and trying to get them to come to a certain level are starting off at extremely different levels. And this is very common. We kind of see this. So if you go to a grade 5 classroom, you will find that there are children who are not able to recognize letters or recognize numbers. And there are also some children who are able to operate more or less at a grade 5 level. Now, this is just the grade 5 classroom. Your actual classroom may actually have a mixed grade classroom, which means there are children of different grades. And in that context, teaching at the right level is a term that we use when we are not using technology, adaptive learning, where the technology itself can go to the level of the child based on their answers. So that seems to be getting much more effective results than a kind of a one-size-fits-all, or an approach where you say that I'm going to train the teachers and leave it at that. And this is what we are finding in study after study, and even in contexts which vary quite a bit. So even in high performance schools where you find that learning levels are already high, or what we call the elite private schools in India, we find that even there the range of learning levels varies quite a bit. And adaptive learning, which actually says that I'm going to determine the level of the child and then teach at that level, seems to cause a much more impact in terms of what kids are learning than something which says this is grade 5 and we are doing this for grade 5.
Thank you. How about nudge-based learning, Chris?
So I think the switch from quantity to quality, I think we still have to continue to invest in inputs. I just want to say that first. I think having teachers that have been invested in and having infrastructure are important. I think that to the extent that those are things that people have invested more in up until now, I think the move towards raising efficiency is something that I think is kind of where we're in this scope where we're trying to raise efficiency of the things that are already there, take advantage of the resources we already have. And there, I think information and the provision of information and using what you already have more efficiently has a lot to offer. The particular work that we've been doing in several countries in Latin America has to do with, to some extent, getting kids to want to learn more for different reasons, or maybe realize that they have opportunities in the future that would require them to have this education, or basically the teachers are the same, the schools are the same, but the kids are getting more motivated. There's a lot of different ways that this could happen. At a higher level, you could imagine that there's a lot of information that's dispersed out in the economy outside, maybe say things about labor markets or things about scholarships and financial aid or things that kids would need to know to be able to make good decisions regarding how much effort to put in, or teachers, what type of things to teach and what types of things to do. And technology today is giving us an opportunity. It's like there's technology being developed that's being used in organizations everywhere, private sector and public, to harness this information and make the people that are in that organization make better decisions and make it more efficient. So I view it as a complementary type of policies that are complementary to any other types of investments that would just make your prior efforts just give you more bang for buck. So I think that there's a lot of scope, and that's kind of a wider, higher up view than just a particular nudge here or kind of convincing someone to do something here. It's just thinking about it broader, like empowering people with better information to make better decisions.
So the nudge-based innovation that we saw here had to do with convincing students to stay in school, right?
And yes, and we were lucky enough to work with the government and evaluate this at scale, where 50% of the schools in the country ran this program in the schools as part of their curriculum. The school districts implemented it, the teachers did it. We just kind of developed it over 3 years together with them. We saw that they have higher learning as well. It's not a super big effect. It's not as big. It's not nearly as big as, say, for example, the effects we see from MindSpark, for example. But these are things that we just get kids to have, information about things that they might have not thought about. So in a class that you think about the future, you talk about, there's a curriculum that says we're going to talk about what you're going to do when you grow up, and what are the things you're going to need to have, the skills you're going to need to have. This is empowering the teachers by giving them a media tool to do it, but also in that tool we've condensed information about labor markets and about all these statistics that might be hard for someone to go find on their own or find out from their family if nobody in their family is more educated, and so we just make it easier for people in the classroom to do what they want to do anyway. So they adapt it and they do it, and it works. Of course, it was a lot of work after many years of working with the schools to find something that they like. But I think that was one example of what I was saying earlier.
Exactly, thank you. And when you think about adaptive learning and nudge-based learning for Laura, how does that work with teaching at the right level and the skill grouping that occurs in that particular model that has been shown to have a great impact through a number of RCTs that JPAL has been involved in?
Yeah, so I suppose the question around the system and trying something new has been a really interesting thing we've been working on. So what we've been doing as JPAL Africa is trying to take the generalized lessons we're learning about teaching at the right level and adaptive learning and bring an evidence-informed program to Zambia. And so work with the government there very closely to try and build a program which uses the lessons that we've learned from the evidence, but makes it a Zambia program that is sensible for the local context.
Good, thank you. And Susanna, how about the public-private partnerships, the project that's going on right now in Liberia, and how does adaptive learning, for example, I don't know if there are nudge-based innovations included in those interventions, but the adaptive learning, I think, is part of what probably you're seeing and your support and coordination of the different models that are being implemented in that particular project?
So the Partnership Schools for Liberia programme, some of you may know, involves 8 private operators, both for-profit and non-profit, who in the first year were running 93 schools in Liberia, 93 primary schools. These were government schools, the teachers remained on government contracts, the schools remained public. These organisations came in to try to sort of turn around essentially dysfunctional schools. The 8 operators had between sort of 4 and 25 schools each, and part of the randomised evaluation that colleagues at IPA, together with Justin Sandifer and his co-authors ran, was to look at sort of, first of all, does the programme as a whole work to improve learning gains in Liberia? But secondly, to look at sort of some of the models that those 8 different operators implemented, and to kind of scrutinise whether or not there were particular ones that worked better than others. But to be very clear, kind of the main purpose of the randomised evaluation was to look at whether or not partnership schools as a programme worked, not whether individual kind of pedagogies or models were more effective. That said, it's fascinating to look at the different models that the 8 different organisations did run in their schools, sort of ranging from Bridge Academies that has a very technology-based approach, through to some of the kind of local Liberian organisations that really worked hard on teacher development and community engagement. So lots of really interesting things, including adaptive learning, coming out of that process. And some of you may know that in Liberia, sort of the overage enrollment is a huge challenge. So the average age in early childhood education is age 8, so about 4 years above what it should be. And so actually trying to kind of figure out how you deal with teaching at the right level in that kind of situation is really quite challenging.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Good point. Thank you. All right, this question's for Laura. Although teaching at the right level model has been rigorously tested in multiple environments and geographies, the critical details of implementation, as we were talking earlier actually, could be very context specific. If we find something that works in a given context, how confident can we be that it will work in other environments and could even be taken to scale elsewhere? So in scaling or replicating a program, in what ways can you afford to be adaptable?
Okay, so I think we're really fortunate when it comes to the teaching at the right level evidence, because there's a real body of evidence now that has been generated over many years and through an iterative learning process. And so what we've learned is that there's a number of core principles, and this is how we like to see it, that need to hold and be implemented well for the program to be likely to have impact. So that's the first piece. So it's less about the specific detail of the program that was delivered in India, but rather what that detail in some sense was trying to achieve. So if we take an example, the first principle is that we have this idea that learners, as has been said before, it's very heterogeneous learners in the classroom. The teachers have very dense curricula and they're under pressure to deliver these. Lots of children get left behind, and we find by the times we get to grades 3, 4, and 5, we may have half a class where learners haven't been able to master basic literacy or numeracy. So this technology, in some sense, pedagogical tool has come in to try and address this situation and say, how do we help learners who have now missed the chance to focus on these basic skills, acquire these basic skills so they can then again take advantage of the curriculum? So one of the things you have to do in this model is be able to identify where the learners are at, so assess them, and then group them by level so that then you can focus on their level. So in India, that's going to happen in local languages in Indian schools, and even so there'll be assessments that are localized to India, but even the way you group your learners during your teaching at the right level time will operate in a different way in different environments. So what we did in Zambia was to go and with our local partners there, help develop the tools, first the tests that are right for Zambia, that can discriminate at those different levels in the local Zambian language. Then we had to work through piloting in the system to say, how do you group learners within the Zambian education system during this time of the school day across grades in a way that works for you in the Zambian schooling system? So we're less worried that this is done exactly the same way as it's done in India, but rather that we ultimately achieve this goal of groups of learners are then able to absorb the teaching at the right level. And there's multiple examples of this. And so something we've learned through spending a lot of time with the evidence is how to pull out what these key principles are, and then how to share these with our local partners so that we almost keep our focus on what it is that we're trying to achieve.
Can you share any local principles that you, as examples?
I mean, we were laughing about this earlier. So one of the things that comes up is this idea that in India, the teacher sits on the floor for many reasons. To connect, it's a way to connect with learners. It's a way to use the floor as a space to do work, etc. And the first thing many people will say to you is, in an African context, a teacher might not sit on the floor, right? But the principle here is to connect with the learners, to have a space to be able to do your education work. And so there's different ways you can achieve that. So in Zambia, you will try and understand how you do that with your teachers, and maybe they put a little chair on the floor and the learners sit around them, and maybe there's other solutions. I think the other key thing that's come through these programs is that you really need strong mentoring and monitoring support, and that's a really important piece that one needs to hold. I mean, you asked, how confident are you that this can be taken to another context? Well, we're confident that if you can deliver these key principles of the Teaching at the Right Level program, you'll get the impacts on basic numeracy and literacy. What we're less sure about is whether new systems can implement these well. And so we've done a lot of process monitoring in our 80-school pilot we've been doing in Zambia to try and understand, can you actually deliver these pieces? And we've actually found pretty good implementation, so the core principles of teaching at the right level. And the other thing we've been testing, which goes more to this bigger scale argument, is can the mentoring and monitoring systems that we've put in place deliver good mentoring and monitoring? Because if they can do that, and we can grow that in the system, then we feel more confident that the system itself can deliver this at an implementation level, quality and with fidelity that you need for impact.
Thank you. Chris, here's a question that is about the RCT that you conducted in the Dominican Republic that shows that integrating information plus the nudge-based innovations in education and into government programs has a substantive impact on the retention rates. We were talking about that a little bit earlier. So my question is, how would you advise a government official in another country who is looking to achieve similar outcomes?
So I think actually what was just being discussed about, like, kind of core principles and what you can translate and what you can. I think here the core principle is that you could think about that students might not have the ideas about what they need to do to succeed, or might not be thinking about what they need to do to get to the next step. And this idea that they might not see the value in education if they think that later on they're not going to be able to use it, or they don't have role models around them. So this idea of that they might have less access to information about why these things are useful because of their social network, that's like the starting point. That's like within the narrow particular treatment, the thing that we did. I think the broader principle could be, once you have a way to communicate with students using technology, you can funnel in all kinds of other messages that you might want to have the kids know. You might have a new scholarship program that you want to explain eligibility requirements to kids, and you could just add that on to something that you already have because you've built this infrastructure that allows you to communicate directly with students. And to some extent, you want to take advantage of the fact that they have to go to school, you're sitting them down, and you have somebody that it's a platform to give them information. And so to some extent, I think, well, if corporations spend millions of dollars to try to get you to drink Coca-Cola or Pepsi, why, this is, to some extent, we're trying to get a message to kids, and if we have this platform, we can do it to do lots of things and support the efforts that teachers are doing. You could do it for learning, but you could do it for just, other decisions that have to do with being consistent with a plan to move on and use education to further your human development.
So it's pretty adaptable across contexts.
I think, yeah, and I think, for example, we got to this project basically because there was prior evidence in Dominican Republic, RCT evaluation by Robert Jensen, published, showing that when you gave kids information about returns to education, they got more education. And so the question was, well, can this work at scale, and what can we do? Why hasn't anybody implemented this? This was a couple of years ago now. And so we ended up doing something not exactly the same. We did it through videos. We told kids about other things like non-monetary benefits of education, financial aid, like role models, things that other people had written papers that thought that could be good, but also things that the Dominican government thought was important. So we took like the core principle is maybe kids are making decisions that aren't optimal because they don't have access to information or access to someone to give them advice to talk about these things. So if that's the general point, let's try to go in and do the best job we can with something we think might work. And then the academic part is you try to like tease out what worked better, what didn't work as good, to then think about how it could go somewhere else. And I think the points you raised, which was like, what are the things that we think are the main key core things? That's some of the things we're trying to learn. Like, are the statistics really important? Is it really relevant? Because so we had different treatment arms that were the exact same thing with no numbers. Because we don't know, maybe those numbers are hard to get. I mean, I don't know if maybe in other countries they might not have good statistics to provide students. So these are the steps that we kind of took to try to get these core things that we could translate. And working together with the government to figure out what they think works. They were adamant about not giving kids statistics only on a sheet of paper like Robert Jensen did in his paper. They thought that was a terrible idea. So we were like, fine, let's do something else. And so I'm happy we did go that route.
Yeah, very good. All right, thank you. Sridhar, we've recently seen references to the science of learning in your work and in the broader literature. What do you mean by that? And how is it relevant to policymakers to understand about the science of learning?
Yeah, great. No, I think that's, in fact, even on the earlier question of these principles, what are the principles that apply? For example, suppose somebody says that, we want to implement an adaptive learning program, we're going to put in computers and we will do this, and we were just discussing it before this talk. And what if a government says, no, but we have seen studies which say that when countries put laptops, it didn't work. Or somebody else says, EdTech results are like, all over the place, but not overall impressive. Or somebody else says, no, this study showed that it worked. Each of these are true. You are putting laptops, you are using EdTech. So we find that the reason, so why does something work? Even things like adaptive technology or teaching at the right level, we are the first to say that that's a term that can be used quite easily, but what aspect of it really works? So to us, the science of learning is actually kind of a more rigorous scientific look at pedagogy. Sometimes even with teachers and in education, we have this feeling that education cannot be, it's different. What a teacher does in a class, is something that we can't define. The teacher has to just handle that. We sometimes give an analogy with medicine. So, we say that medical science, so there's an interesting talk, there was a TED talk where I learned of this. There's a book by a doctor called Lewis Thomas, who was a doctor in Boston. And he says that virtually everything that we consider modern medicine has been developed post the 1930s. And that's because two important discoveries or inventions, anesthesia and antibiotics were created around this time. And that literally led to the development of medical science. And today, the kind of medical science we follow, the diagnostics, are pretty standardized. Whether you're doing it in Washington, D.C., or in India, or in a village in Africa, you'll probably get tested for hepatitis B in a similar way. That has become a scientific process, and it, you kind of build on it. And there are literally thousands of these when literally zero existed in 1920. Now, if I try to take this to education and I say that, how does a teacher deal with a child who's struggling to learn decimal comparisons? Or even something like reading, which is much, much better documented and studied. We find that there's a gap between, if we could provide teachers with, this is the kind of information that is available, and not just teachers, but technology programs, that to us, that body of knowledge, is the science of learning. Now, often policymakers, so again, it's related to this point of, I have this educational challenge in my country. Is it an administrative problem, or is it something else? And often the conclusion is probably because it's being looked at by administrators and policymakers, we look at it as an administrative problem. But we find that if this kind of science, I don't even want to call it technology, if this kind of science were available, it could be used. And our experience has been that this is pretty universal. The kind of problems or mistakes that children make while doing multiplication in grade 2 and 3 turns out to be pretty uniform across. There could be some elements, which are local to the way the language is used in that country or something is taught. But a lot of the errors they make that need to be diagnosed and then corrected turn out to be pretty universal, and many are not widely known. So that is the science of learning that we think needs to be focused on.
Okay, thank you. This question is for Susanna and then Laura. You've both built strong partnerships with key public sector champions to bring evidence-based education interventions to scale. And in your respective collaborations, how have you developed government partnerships and encouraged policymakers to take the current evidence and best practices to heart when designing and working with this large-scale programming?
So I think that's a great question, and I think many of us who work in this space will know that sort of the theory of evidence-based policymaking is sort of more straightforward than the reality, and sort of particularly scaling evidence-based models within a government system is really challenging. One of my colleagues in the UK sort of says that, we, even in the UK, trying to scale an edtech product, for example, the plumbing in the schools in the UK doesn't absorb edtech products effectively. So Wi-Fi doesn't work and tablets get stolen. So actually the absorptive capacity of systems, particularly in the developing world, to sort of take on innovations, evidence-based innovations, and scale them is really challenging. So I'll talk about a couple of examples here. We worked in Madhya Pradesh in India, actually together with colleagues from JPAL who evaluated it to test and scale up a school quality assurance program. So basically a school inspection program, which when ARC worked with the government to design it and to test it in sort of around 200 schools, it actually worked pretty effectively. We didn't have RCT data on it, but actually the kind of process was working and the schools were being visited and inspected and the follow-ups were happening. When it then scaled with the government to 22,000 schools, because everything in India happens at massive scale, those kinds of links in the chain broke down and the schools weren't visited and they weren't followed up and the school improvement plans didn't happen. So I think sort of how you think about the plumbing in an education system to actually make sure that a program can be scaled up effectively is something that all of us are trying to grapple with. Now in Partnership Schools for Liberia, sort of in a sense, that challenge is overcome by the nature of the program because the government isn't actually delivering the scaled up product, the private operators are. But I think if you look at that, while we were all sort of really proud of the strong learning gains in the first year, we only really know what happened in that program because of the randomized control trial, which IPA and the PIs ran. So the only real accountability for those private operators was through that RCT. If the RCT hadn't taken place, we wouldn't know whether the teachers had turned up or whether kids had been excluded or whether learning gains had been achieved. So actually the kind of mechanics in the government system, the plumbing, just to oversee and quality assure and hold accountable those private operators wasn't yet there. So talking about public-private partnerships in particular and how they're scaled up within government systems, I think there's generally a bit too much focus on the kind of the private P and the PPP and not enough focus on the public P. So I think this is actually put very nicely in the recent World Development Report. It's just as hard to oversee private operators potentially as it is to actually run the schools yourselves. So I think we all have to think really hard about how we make sure that we get those mechanics and the plumbing right in government systems to kind of be effective partners to them as they try to scale evidence-based models.
All right, thank you. And Laura, do you want to speak to that as well?
Great, yes. So just to say our partnership with the Zambian government is currently at 80 pilot schools, so we're not yet at scale, but they're committed to rolling out to 1,800, which is a good share of the schools in Zambia. And so I can talk to the partnership development that we've been doing with them and how we've engaged with them with the evidence piece, because I think that's been really interesting and we've learned a huge amount. So the first thing is we came to Zambia to a country to actually share some education evidence, but they were really grappling with this problem, the government and development partners. They had identified this issue. They said, we have all these children who are already in grades 3 to 5 who are falling far behind, and we want to do something with them. They'd already actually constituted a catch-up working group which had its own name. What they didn't know was really what to do, and they were really interested in learning from the evidence. How can we help these children catch up? So that's a really lovely policy window to be presented with. And for us, we said, oh, well, we've got lots of interesting evidence to share with you. And our first lesson here was, how do we bring this into a format that's tractable for them to work with? and to make decisions. And so we actually spent a lot of time realizing that we needed to convert the evidence in the forms it was into a way which we could work together to help make decisions. And then we did a lot of meetings and workshops and interactions where we worked with them to grapple through what does the evidence mean for the Zambian context. And so we actually did an executive education course on impact evaluation of social programs to help them understand where the evidence comes from. But within that, we built case studies that were relevant to the Zambian context and asked them to work through these problems from a Zambian perspective. And we had high-level decision makers in these meetings, and so they were able to think through, how would I do this in Zambia? We then had many meetings with decision makers looking at the different options that might work in Zambia. And because, again, there's a big wealth of evidence in this area, there's almost a menu you can choose from. And so the government made choices and chose from this menu in some sense based on the evidence that was there and based on what they thought would be sustainable for them. And so it's been the evidence piece has really been built into the pilots that they then chose to deliver. We were very firm with them to say, if you choose this model, you have to make sure you've got this mentoring, monitoring piece and like that. And we found ways to kind of build in what we think are models that, if delivered well, would hold impact. The other piece, I think, just to say, is we're building this learning into the model, the pilots, all the time. And so we come back together with the data that we've been collecting to adapt, update, and to use this so that we can strengthen the model that rolls out.
All right, thank you. Let me ask this, and again, this is to Laura and Susanna, but I think Chris and Sridhar, you also can chime in on this as well. Once you're piloting an innovation or getting the innovation started, whether it's with public-private partnerships or partnership schools, or through the teaching at the right level, or if you're doing an innovation that's in partnership with the government, or you're doing adaptive learning through MindSpark with the government. How do you ensure that the decision makers at the government level continue to incorporate, once you have finished your pilot or your work, what kinds of efforts are required to incorporate this on-the-ground learning into policy directives to keep this moving forward? I mean, how many times have we seen these kinds of pilots, really effective, very successful initiatives, just sort of fade away with changes in the government staff or elections, and then everything starts over again and over again. So what have you learned in your experiences that might help us understand a little bit about what kinds of work do we need to do to improve the probability that these really successful and important efforts can continue?
I mean, I can say three brief things to that. One is, I think we probably work with 7 or 8 ministries of education on public policy reform. And I think actually there's a far greater appetite for evidence than people often think. So actually policymakers do generally want to do the right thing for children under their jurisdiction. They are hungry for evidence, both sort of from outside, but also sort of contextually relevant evidence. So I think kind of leveraging that and trying to build sort of multi-layer relationships with ministry bureaucracies and so on, and make sure there's that understanding of the evidence at every level. And I know colleagues at JPAL and IPA do that sort of really, really well. So secondly, I think, without wanting to sound like a broken record, going back to the sort of structure of the system and making sure that actually there is that capacity within the system itself to collect data from schools and to make sure there's kind of proper channels to feed it upwards. So the Minister of Education in Ghana is sort of a super, really, really pro-evidence and is kind of horrified to come into his new job and find he's not getting the kind of data he wants to see from the schools under his jurisdiction, despite the fact there's actually quite a lot of human resources in the districts who are visiting schools and are collecting data. It's just not coming through in a form that he finds sort of useful and accessible. So I think thinking about how we can help reconfigure those kind of data collection and management structures to actually provide policymakers with more useful evidence. And then sort of finally, I think sort of, this is a point that Laura made, just making sure that that evidence is presented in a way that people can understand and can sort of really engage with sounds simple, but often isn't. I think we're trying to get much better at sort of the data viz stuff that we do, so policymakers can really sort of properly engage with evidence that we're finding in the short and long term.
All right. Chris or Sridhar?
I'll jump in. I think actually one thing, so a complementary vision, so one way is like we find things that work somewhere and we want everyone else to adopt them. Another way to approach this could be you talk to the people, the policymakers, and you kind of get a sense, you figure out what they want to do already. And generally they're pretty broad. And then then there's a moment when they decide all the specifics, but nobody was politically super stuck on any of the specifics. And that's where kind of evidence-based policymaking can make a real dent, and we don't have to worry about trying to convince everybody that it's good to do whatever the policy is, like the broad policy. Maybe they want to invest in infrastructure, maybe they want to give kids laptops. But you could take that and then you bring in your knowledge of policy evaluation and kind of building on what you were just saying, thinking about all the different plumbing, all the plumbing that needs to get fixed, all the data, all the reinforcement things that need to happen so that we don't mess this up, the steps, maybe piloting and then trying and then going. And so that is something that potentially we know how to do, generate, rigorous evidence on what is working, what isn't. But instead of being like, do this policy in this other sphere totally different from what the minister already said publicly in like a speech, just use your tools to find within the framework of things they already want to do the best version. And that's, I think, a way that's super easy. Once you find a version that's more efficient than the others, I think one is you don't have to worry about convincing them to do it because they're going to do it anyway. But two, it's an easy way to get in, and then you can develop their infrastructure to collect data, and you develop that plumbing that's going to be useful for other things too. And so now we got our foot in the door, and then maybe next time they say, that was really useful. So one of the ministers in Dominican Republic, at the very beginning, he said, I'll sign on to this thing to do these videos, whatever, but this is like a cannon to kill a mosquito, he said in the meeting. He's like, you're coming in with all this USAID money and all these PhDs and all this army of like awesome technology and stuff, and I'm spending 4 points of GDP building schools. And you're not helping me figure out how to do that. You're doing the video. I want the videos to work, but like, so in that sense, I'm like, well, if you want me to help you with schools, I can help you with schools. And so there's like an easy window. Now, that same minister with a different government, they're spending a lot of money giving laptops to everybody. And he called me up. He says, I want you to come do that thing you did last time for the other thing, but can you do it on this now? And so now we're like showing that the model works. And so that's a way to get people to adapt, take evidence. To some extent, they saw it worked, and they saw the process worked more than the specific evidence, like this T-stat on this particular intervention was significant. It's like, no, he just saw the process. And I think that that's a thing that, for example, USAID puts money and people do things in a country. If the process and the learning of like how things get done is something that is successful, that's something that just is useful for other policies. Going forward. So that's like a spillover, I think. It's like an advantage.
All right, thanks. Sridhar, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the same points, but the first thing I would say is that, those of us who are either implementing it or studying it ourselves feel convinced or confident that, this has reached a certain level of outcome. I mean, I have seen even in our own programs where, there's a stage where we feel this is ready for a larger pilot, but not yet ready for asking for a larger thing. And that really helps, having that and then having that in the form that people can see. So whether it's case studies or videos. And so that is step one. Step two, I find, is policymakers, a kind of capacity building for policymakers where you actually explain both the philosophy and the data. And I find that works the most. I mean, in fact, even more than the data sometimes when they kind of really see that why does this thing make sense? And that's usually a matter of engagement and kind of answering their questions and explaining it to them. The third is at the teacher or the implementer level where, how do you do it? If those pieces are, I think this is a product challenge, which is that if you have a great idea, everyone's convinced, but you haven't worked out those pieces that are going to make it work for the teacher. So if you were a teacher in that place, you would actually struggle with those pieces. And it's not easy, but it's possible to address that. And the fourth, where relevant, but I think that's relevant in a lot of cases, is parents. We find that if the benefits are communicated to them, it kind of helps put things in place because they exert a certain amount of pressure. It's not very large, but on the teachers, and that the government or the policymakers sense that kind of a demand that this is there, or there is excitement about it. So that's the parts I find, and I personally find the first part, which is ourselves being convinced that this is working well and we can communicate it, is the biggest of the four.
Okay, thank you. So all of you have talked about sort of building system being having not only to do with what you're doing with that system, but making sure that the system understands why and is able to see the process as something that's sort of integral to the government system, not something external that you're doing this one thing, but you're building their capacity by showing them a process that can work across, and you were suggesting, Chris, across ideas, not just in the one thing that you're working in, that will be essential. And that you have to also, and we haven't talked about this, pay attention to the community and the parents. Sridhar, you mentioned that, and that's something just across the board from all of the work that you're doing in the field. Can each of you speak just briefly about the community engagement piece of the work that you're doing? How do you see that situated in the context of the projects that you're working on? Let's start with Chris.
Yeah, so I think that my perspective on kind of the different projects that I've been working on, I think the community kind of is like all the stakeholder participants in this. And I think what has been a guiding kind of idea has been, if from the very beginning to think like, if I want this to actually be a policy that is going to actually affect a lot of people, then I need to think about all the possible people that are going to be involved along the way, all the way to the end, that will support this and keep it going. And I think that one thing that we did with basically this through JPAL was these ideas of having almost like a board of directors. It wasn't really like, that's not the really, but it's people that are involved, or maybe they're not involved, they're actually people that might stop it later. Have them be there from the beginning, and then they kind of feel it's their thing now because they gave their input, and then we adapted it to what they thought, and then later they're like, no, that's our thing, we don't want to. So in our case specifically, the thing we're talking about here, teachers need to be involved and need to like this. And so, for example, the minister of whatever, in charge of the teachers is like, we can't go in there and say, teachers, you have more curriculum, you need to learn, because the teachers are going to not like that. But if we show a video covering similar curriculum they already do, then they're going to not oppose it and they'll love it. And so then that process of working with the teachers of being like what they like in it, what they don't like it, that wasn't necessarily something that I would have thought of initially, but thinking that they could stop it later on was something that was useful. And we did do a lot of work with parents. Like we went out and we did a lot of work with parents but I was mostly interested, we were mostly from academic perspective, we wanted to understand the role of parents. But in the practical, like, can we scale up anything with visiting homes? It was like, we don't think so. And so we didn't, that was the investment, was to understand what was going on. So I think that's like something like within, maybe in another country that they have a system where they visit homes through social workers or some other program, maybe they'd have cash transfers, and maybe there's something you could layer on with parents there. It would be great. But in this case, we didn't. So I was basically thinking to do this at scale, who are we gonna need to support this or not oppose it,
Right.
Was kind of the guiding principle.
Right. Laura?
Yeah, I think in a similar vein, our focus is the school community, so we certainly let parents know. I think there were parent meetings around wherever the new program was coming in, because it's important for them to understand what their children are learning. But the core mission of what we're trying to do is a school-based program, and really building champions at multiple levels, where the teacher, again, is in some ways our greatest advocate for the program and the greatest champion for the program.
Yeah. I think both of you then are speaking to the importance of making certain that teachers are on board in the process of understanding the new program and seeing it as valuable, that it isn't imposed on them, but it's a process of harnessing their support for it. So I think that's something that we often just go in and say, this is really good for you, this is going to help the children learn, and you need to do it. Or the government says, that's what you're going to be teaching. But taking that time, it seems like there are some really great payoffs for that.
If I can just quickly add to that, I mean, we've been so heartened by how enthusiastic the teachers in Zambia have been about this program. They enjoy it. And that's been something that we've seen, you know, and that's been almost surprising, right? Like how enthusiastic they've been. And so this is, they become your greatest, yeah, they could become the greatest champions.
Yeah,
right?
that's great. And Susanna, how about you?
I would echo what your colleagues said. When we work on public-private partnerships, it's often a controversial space, and we need all the champions we can get. And actually, both in Delhi and in the Western Cape in South Africa, on 2 occasions, parents have saved our programme. So the Western Cape example, there was sort of some rumours spread by civil society and unions and so on that this programme was going to be charging fees and sort of bringing in for-profit operators and firing teachers. And actually the parents in 3 of the schools petitioned to keep the PPP in their schools. So that was actually quite a seminal moment for the programme, was when sort of, the teachers were on strike and the parents came in and kind of saved the programme. So I think sort of making sure that you are sort of really engaging with the community so they understand what's happening and they support what's happening, because it's their kids and they're the ones who care most ultimately.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Yeah. I just maybe add one point that is slightly, it's related to the capacity point, which is, we think of capacity as train the teachers, and obviously it's important. But again, in a country like India, we find that, okay, who is going to train the teachers? You need to have the capacity to that training, which typically is an institution. And often these institutions exist, but the institutions do not have that capacity. So we say that institutional capacity is a prerequisite to this kind of training. And whether it's at the district level or even at the national level, that capacity needs to exist. And for a prerequisite for that institutional capacity is that expertise or body of knowledge. So for example, one of the topics that I think people kind of agree on more easily is if you look at capacities to do certain types of assessments, for example. Now this is something that we say that unless this capacity exists at a system level, which again comes back to research or what I earlier called the science of learning, you cannot have the institutional capacity. So this, and again from policymakers' point of view, they often say, okay, train the teachers, we need to train the teachers. But the reason why it often doesn't happen is that these earlier 2 pieces are missing. And so I assume that if I want to do something on reading or on primary math, I will train the teachers and they will do it. But these 2 pieces on having that capacity in the system as a whole, and then embodying that or housing that in an institution which is nurtured and which kind of builds on it, are very, very, and that kind of requires long-term thinking. Doing a training for teachers is easier. So I say I need to do it, I put it in the thing, I plan it out and I do it. But the earlier 2 pieces require me to think at least 10 years ahead and say this is going to build. That's obviously difficult everywhere, but we find that these 2 pieces are really critical if the change has to happen.
But you'll still teach the teachers if it's the right, while you're building the capacity.
Absolutely.
It's the airplane in the sky,
Absolutely.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Kind of building it. Okay, great, thanks. All right, to everyone, I can see that time's passing very quickly. I think I could certainly sit here for hours and listen to this conversation. But I wanted to ask everyone, this panel is representing a wide variety of operational models, and it includes private enterprises, it includes nonprofits, it includes public-private partnerships, and research partners. So for each of you, if you could think about whether there, in your thinking, whether there's an ideal business model when you're scaling up innovations. And how might this differ for us, or would it differ for technology and education versus traditional education models? And so anyone can respond first.
Okay, so I'll jump in. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I think we hadn't realized that all these are actually represented on the panel, and I think it's amazing. So I mean, we find, like, in our own case, I mean, we are a private company, we're a for-profit company, but with a very strong mission, and we've always kind of worked with both the, there's the elite private schools, and then there is the public schools, and we've always said that we will work with both, and we see value and learning across them. At the same time, we find, so I find that, each of these, one of the debates that we've had is that, is a non-profit model going to be more effective in working in the space? I mean, we are often told, we've actually faced it less, but we're often told that government would say that, this sector, we will not allow for-profits to come in. And, you do hear it happens a bit. What I found is that the one common piece that works through all this is depth of expertise, is building that expertise. And secondly, this expertise is not, it's not expertise of a private organization or a non-profit or a research organization, but it's kind of a systemic, it's like the tide that lifts all boats. And hence you find that each element of it, so we partner with JPAL, for example, for some of the work. So for each, how do you push the level of expertise in the system as a whole? And it turns out that there is something that each of these models kind of works very effectively with. And we have seen that when we work in a very small scale, it's enough that we are able to do it in partnership with a few schools. But once we have to go to the next level, we need to have somebody, not because JPAL has a reputation, but because the tools that they use and the expertise that they have, we ourselves find that we must work with that. So we literally find that on the route to going from a smaller program to one that goes to scale, there is actually a role for each of these types of setups. And I think that role is in expanding the larger expertise or understanding for the system as a whole, if that made sense.
Okay, great, thank you. Who'd like to go next?
I mean, I think sort of in theory, the legal incorporation of an organisation shouldn't matter. It's sort of the management capacity, the mission alignment, the theory of change that matters. I think sort of, you alluded to this, I think the political economy reality that we work in, often it does matter perhaps more than it should. So that said, and speaking so just from ARC's perspective here, I think that, I do believe that it's the government's duty to make sure that every child can access a quality education. It's not necessarily their duty to provide it in every case, but it's their duty to sort of guarantee it. And therefore, to me, I think we all have a responsibility working in the education space to make sure that there is that capacity within the bureaucracy to play that role effectively. And I sort of often feel sad when I see all of these amazing kind of opportunities that are out there for private sector entrepreneurs, like sort of the Ashoka and Echoing Green and all these kind of wonderful fellowships you can do. And you have these bureaucrats sitting in ministries of education who are, really responsible for overseeing kind of hundreds of thousands of schools in their jurisdiction. And there's not that kind of sort of sense of let's try and build up that capacity of sort of entrepreneurial bureaucrats, for want of a better phrase. So I do think kind of thinking about how we can make sure that we all sort of contribute to those public sector objectives in whichever way we can, whichever legal incorporation we have is really important. But I believe that the sort of the nature and structure of each organisation shouldn't matter.
If I can come in quickly, I think for us, because we partner with all different organisations to learn, we think if an organisation is set up for scale and has a vision for scale, they're often the best person to scale through. I think as a research organisation, we're really interested in the public goods of what we're learning more generally. And what we found in trying to take all these lessons to a new context is a real gap actually around who should be really helping bring this into a system. And so this has been a big lesson for us about how do you think about taking evidence to scale more broadly. And in fact, what we've learned is that it takes a whole lot of effort, energy, and almost sophistication to be able to straddle the world of academia and the complexity there and the world of governance and complexity there. So we found this to be kind of a new space almost that needs investment and work.
Yes, great, thanks. Question about 1 minute?
Yeah, I mean, I would follow up on I'm a member of JPAL and I'm academic, so I think that the institutions that could potentially make the government sector potentially more efficient or more quick to have investments in this infrastructure, to have data, to do evaluations, the pilot, I think are actually a lot of this partnerships to do things at scale. These efforts are generating relationships between researchers that kind of push all these inputs that are necessary to do an evaluation, say, but then those inputs are useful more generally. And I think that in some initiatives, like an initiative we did with JPAL LAC in Peru, it ended up being an office that was called the Minedu Lab, which is basically you're going to do these, take ideas that the government has and evaluate them rigorously. But that generates a moment where researchers are talking to the government when they're thinking about what to do. And that's a perfect moment for a researcher to say, actually, that's a good idea. I've seen some work on that. Let's talk to the researcher that's like the world expert on that. And then the next day, the government hasn't really worked out all the details, but now they have access to the evidence really fast before they've kind of like coalesced around a specific implementation. I think that type of partnership has a lot of potential. I think there's a lot more investment needs to be done there. So that's kind of going to your point earlier.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I see that our time is running down. We have about 1 minute left. So I want to just take this time to give a really very heartfelt thank you to our panel members. This has been an extraordinary session for me, and all of the amazing work that you're doing in the field and the difference that you're making in the places where you're working is greatly appreciated. We know that we will continue to learn from you. We'll keep looking for your papers and reports on the work that you're doing. I also want to thank the audience for joining us today on this panel, and I know you all as well will be looking forward to hearing more from our colleagues, and let's give them a really warm thanks for